Hello. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight on behalf of Blair Gowrie and Artery Yes Group. For those of you who don't know, we're a non-political party group of like-minded people, all with a common goal of looking for Scotland to become an independent country. Everybody's welcome to join the group, and I hope that over the course of the next few months, as we drive on towards independence, that we'll have a few speakers who can come and give us the benefit of their expertise and their understanding of the different political situations that Scotland will face. I've got to admit tonight, before I introduce Lesley, that I almost got everything off to a bad start. I was doing a bit of research on the internet about background, and I picked up on a comment which had suggested that Lesley had said that she thought Theresa May was out of this world. I was kind of taken aback by that, and I was almost going to phone Kevin and cancel the gig. But when I did more research, I found out what she really did say, and she said she didn't know what planet Theresa May was on. And I think that was probably more in line with where Lesley's coming from. Born in Wolverhampton, Lesley spent 10 years, her first 10 years growing up in Belfast. And at the age of 13, her parents moved to Bearsden. Lesley then went on to Oxford University and became, at 21, the youngest female to become president of the Students' Union. So I think it's an incredible achievement at the time that happened. Not that it was so long ago, but after Oxford, Lesley went on to Cardiff University and took a diploma in journalism. From there followed a series of life-developing events through journalism, broadcasting, setting up a newspaper with ladies in Africa, and all sorts of other ventures, good and bad, along the way, until eventually Lesley's ended up being a person that I think the whole of Scotland can look up to with great respect about the way that she looks at things, researches things, deals in facts, and can relate these in a very clear way that people can understand. So I think we're very, very blessed to have her here tonight, and I hope you can give her a warm welcome from Blair Gowrie.
Thanks very much. No pressure. Yes, that was a bit of a shocker, actually. My brother and I family grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and when we were 11, we knew that my parents were Highlanders. My mother was from Wick, my dad was from a road junction in Banffshire, which we visited each of them for 2 weeks every summer for 16 years. So we knew that there was Scots in the family. But the shock when we were told at the age of 11 that we were actually born in Wolverhampton. I mean, but anyway, you know, the Mongol nation was never truer for our family anyway. And perhaps that's kind of really quite relevant now, because what I really want to talk about is to look over the weather that we're experiencing at the moment. And what we're in is weather. I mean, it's important weather. Weather can be extremely destructive. But actually, what we're looking for is climate change. We're looking to get right out of a situation where we are tethered to a backward-looking, archaic, elitist, unequal government, and a society populated in the main part by a population that just doesn't seem to care about these things. Or if it does, never translates that into anything approaching what would be needed to modernise Britain, to make it anywhere you'd want to stay. So in all of that, if you look forwards, I think one of the things that can sometimes be difficult for people is the feeling that we are doing this alone. That we alone in Europe, I mean, everybody feels like this when they do anything in life for the first time, actually. You know, you feel like there's nobody like yourselves, you're having all the problems yourself, nobody's ever seen this kind of thing. We're the last. In the North Atlantic, we're the last nation to look for independence. I hear there's like a wee drum roll happening behind everything here, so are you all right with that? There's something rattling in the microphone or somewhere. Is it yourself? Is it my imagination? Okay. So, I mean, this is what I really want to look at, because the kind of, if you had the same education I had, I mean, here I grew up in Northern Ireland, and we knew nothing about the history of Northern Ireland, because obviously it was too hot to trot. You know, we learned a lot about Brian Boru, because I think he existed and died before it all got a little bit sectarian, and then it stopped, and we learned English history. When I came to Scotland, hey, I knew how to do this. We learned English history. So everybody of an age, and there's a few of us around here, will not really have been steeped in what is relevant at our latitude. But what's relevant to Scotland is not just the great imperial histories of England vis Britain, or France or Germany, although these have been powerful and influential. It's not even the United States. It's a lot to do with the small countries beside us that have been airbrushed, actually, out of our ken. That is the Nordic countries that have actually been doing extraordinarily well and sort of negating every argument that's been punted Scotland's way. They're small, that's problematic, strange. They actually happen, the lot of them, apart from Iceland that's getting back, they happen to have AAA credit rating. We don't. They happen to be at the top of every well-being table that you can get. Table. It's tedious. It's tedious how well they do. Iceland is practically at 100% literacy. And this is Iceland, a country that was so inhospitable that it was actually discovered 3 times before anyone stayed. You know, we need to know more about our own extended folk. We know about our own folk, we've got an idea about the Celts, but actually we're part of a bigger thing. If Alex Salmond, with his ineffable timing, hadn't kiboshed slightly the arc of prosperity by lining us up with Ireland, Norway and Iceland at a time when Iceland was about to go off the register and Ireland was about to follow it, we would probably have a little bit of a more idea now, or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps the only reason that people know much about the Nordics is that we reference. But this could be extremely important for Scotland for 2 reasons. One is, we should get our peckers up. We are a sleeping giant. We're not a small country. From the perspective of where we are, in the North Atlantic, we are enormous. You know, has anyone been to the Faroe Islands? Right, well done, Jason. It is a bit like your last Monroe, actually. I've been to all the Nordic countries before I got to the Faroes, although they're the closest. But there are 18 little barren lumps of rock between Shetland and Iceland. And actually, although they haven't got a lot going for them apart from their fishing, they do have the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. And any time you hear this from a unionist, just say the words, the Faroes. And the reason is that in 1946, they took a vote, all 30,000 of them. What's the population of Blair, Gowrie and Rattray? That's Sling and Ailith. About there?
9.
9. What we're going to have to sling in as well, then Cooperangus. Well, okay, we're not going to sling in Cooperangus. Anyway, you see what I'm saying? It's not a big population. But these guys decided in 1946 that they wanted to become independent from Denmark. So they had a referendum, and the result was 50.7% yes, which sort of scared the bejesus out of everybody, themselves included. But the Danes did something that the British would never do. They realised they needed to persuade them to stay with a good offer. So what they gave the Faroese was this extraordinary parliament. It's got the usual stuff, it's got all the tax-raising powers that we have not got. It's got a university for 40,000 people that teaches in Faroese, which is a language different from Danish and more like Icelandic. They have control of energy, which is pretty important. If we had that in Scotland, we would have won the independence referendum. And they have control of telecoms and broadcasting. Ditto. Now, not just because of the obvious about broadcasting, but telecoms. I'm glad you're all sitting down, because if you were standing, there could be a few casualties at this. They have the fastest mobile broadband coverage in the world. And the reason is, steady now, the reason is that the Faroese government told Faroese Telecom to do it. I mean, it's that simple. Everybody, Britain is complicated, isn't it? We've got this ludicrous privatised system for telecommunications, for electricity, for everything. So nobody seems to be able to do anything straightforward, but the Faroese just told them to fibre optic the entire set of islands. So they have the fastest 4G coverage in the world, those little remote islands. And it doesn't just go to the 18 islands, remote as they are, it goes right to the edge of the 200-mile limit they unilaterally declared, and up to the height of the helicopter fleet that services it. Because as they put it, this is our community. Why would we leave anyone out? James. That kind of level of ambition, that's what comes from having had the world's most powerfully devolved parliament since 1946. But the icing on the cake for them was that even way back then, they were given the power to sign international treaties. Now that maybe didn't seem like such an important thing until 1973, when Denmark decided to join the EU the same time as Britain. And the Faroese took one look at the common fisheries policy and went, nah, we're not having that. Because it's not usable for anybody that's got a large, 90% of the income in the Faroes is fish. So some of you, I see, sitting around the room, were alive in 1973. You may not have heard of many people dying in the conflicts between Faroes and Denmark over this, because there wasn't any. The Faroese just decided not to join the EU at the same time as the Danes decided to join, and nobody was dead. That is normal. That is the way a normal, modern state is able to accommodate difference. And it arose from the fact that the first time that there was a challenge, the Danish state were kind of mature enough to give the Faroese a lot of power. It hasn't stopped them, they still want independence, but they haven't actually achieved it yet. So there's one example of what you might think. I mean, it'll never happen in Britain, and this is important to know, because if we don't know what everybody else has expected and has achieved in the same situations as us, we will think that somehow we're maybe, this is inevitable, or who would expect anything better. We should be expecting better, because it's been happening better than this all around us for half a century. So there's the Faroese. Greenland also belongs to Denmark. Greenland hadn't rocked the boat by having an independence referendum, so it didn't get such a powerful parliament. But in the 1980s it did. First thing they did, they came out of the EU because the same thing, because of the common fisheries policy. So there's one little kind of example of what the Nordics could tell us about how we might relate to Europe as an independent country. But there's others there. I mean, coming back to Iceland, Iceland and Norway are not in the EU, as you may know. They're in what you would call the halfway house. Now this is the science bit, so this is 30 seconds and then it's over, right? Stay awake. There was 2 kids on the block, trade-wise, in the 1960s in Europe. One of them was the kid that would become the EU, but the other one was the kid that has remained EFTA. That's the European Free Trade Association. And EFTA folk were less keen. EFTA was never into integration. It never wanted institutions. It didn't want a shared currency. It just wanted to trade. And over the peace, the UK was in EFTA. Over the peace, it was mostly the Alps and the Nordics were in EFTA and the UK. And over the peace, almost everybody shifted over to the EU. It shows you actually, at the time, everybody found the prospects of what the EU were up to quite exciting. So in the end, there's only 4 left in EFTA. There's Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. They're tiddlers. And out of them, 3 of them want to have access to the single market. Unaccountably, the Swiss, despite the fact that they're living in the middle of Europe, don't seem to want to have access. You wonder if they've just got a lot of buckshy arrangements that they don't want to kind of declare. But actually, they spent 9 years negotiating their own bilateral agreements. So you want to do it your own way? It takes time, which someone south of the border might have picked up a while ago. So anyway, the 3 then, these guys, they all don't want to be affected by the Common Agricultural or Fisheries Policy. So the 3 of them have created a third organisation called the EEA. That's the European Economic Area. And that is the combination of the 28, soon to become 27 EU members, and these 3. Together, they are the EEA. And it doesn't have much of a secretariat, but it lets you into the single market. So, Iceland and Norway, they can trade into the single market without tariffs. They have to abide by the 4 acquis. They have to have freedom of movement. So that's why Britain's never going to get in. You should say as well, none of EFTA want Britain in because it's massively too big. But the other bonus potentially for independent Scotland in this is that they aren't members of the European Customs Union. And that means that if Britain goes ahead and disastrously decides to complete Brexit what must be the absolute kind of climax of the ludicrousness of the isolationism of Britain and its pomposity, so it jumps right off the top of the cliff despite itself, and we are clever enough to have detached ourselves before they go. If this all happens, our joining EFTA rather than the EU would allow us to make third-party arrangements, that is with Britain, as well as having access to the single market, because we wouldn't be in the customs union. And that could be kind of quite useful for us, because otherwise we're going to be in the same position as Ireland. And, there's something to be said for that. The EEA has got its downsides. Nothing, could be all that great. You don't get something for nothing. You end up paying, each nation pays about 98% of what they would pay as full members. You didn't get much of a discount. And you didn't get much of a say in the rules. Norway, for example, they call the EEA the Nike agreement in Norway because you just do it. You get all these regulations and you just have to abide by them. You didn't get a say in them. And Norway implements about 96% of EU regulations, more than Sweden, which is a member. So that's, if you like, there's a downside of that. But, I can't remember where I was at recently, when somebody pointed out, it could have been Angus Brenton McNeill, who was pointing out that across the world, oh dear, across the world there are only 5 countries that are not in regional trade agreements, and one of them is South Sudan. This is the kind of almost failed state we're talking about, that isn't in a regional agreement with the rest of its neighbours in trade. I wish I could actually rhyme off the 5, because I'm sure they're a pretty unprepossessing group. But there's where Britain's headed, South Sudan, Britain. It's that unusual to not have got something sorted out with your neighbours. So that's kind of like one possibility, and I know a lot of people in Scotland were worried about the fishing, because the Common Fisheries Policy has got challenges. 60% of fish is caught by boats from countries that are not Scotland. We've opened our waters and seen most of the fish disappear. There are big problems about conservation, partly because of that way of running it. So it's very likely if we were in EFTA, we would get control of fishing, we might do a better job. And that's the kind of company we'd be in. Iceland and Norway, no slouches, these folk. These are the kind of people we should be rubbing shoulders with. If we're kind of looking at problems for Scotland, like, should we be drilling out every last bit of oil in the North Sea, every last bit of